The very first trailer for Mortal Kombat 11 made the intentions of the game rather clear, depicting Raiden fighting both a contemporary and nostalgic Scorpion, which in turn signaled what we were in for with this new game. After spanning over 25 in-universe years, the plot of Mortal Kombat 11 would use a rupture in time to expose the combatants of the past against their vastly different future selves. In my last video on Mortal Kombat, which I highly recommend you watch before this one for further context, I discussed how Mortal Kombat's greatest narrative strength is that of organically building upon legacy characters over the course of many years, and Mortal Kombat 11's premise of past meeting future seemed to be the perfect culmination of that quality of the series. As a longtime Mortal Kombat fan, I was hyped for this installment and the paradoxical interactions it would bring. And yet, a part of me was defensive of my love for Mortal Kombat X, my favorite game of all time. Would it just be downhill from here out of my sheer bias? Would the emphasis on the characters of the past be an apologetic shift in focus after the controversy that surrounded MKX's drastic and risky changes, of which I was in the party that loved? These were things beneath my hype that I would have for any Mortal Kombat game that gave me a distinct apprehension for what 11 would bring to the table. And after clearing the game's story mode with my roommate the day the game arrived in the mail, I felt empty, like my entire being had been numbed. And one has to wonder, what could one's favorite video game universe do to cause that? Well, let's start at the beginning, and as far as beginnings go, MK11's isn't bad by any means. Cassie Cage, upon finally gaining the recognition she sought from her parents, loses her mother in a freak accident, making her victory Pyrrhic to say the least, and paving the way for even further growth. Raiden is clearly tipping over the deep end even further, and Scorpion and Sub-Zero, one of the oldest rivalries in gaming, have put their differences aside once and for all. Kronika, the Titan of Time, intends to wipe this timeline, and her disruptions cause the combatants of the past to meet those in the present. And just as the trailer with the twin Scorpions promised, there are interesting and fun interactions abound. The Scorpion, who rediscovered his inner peace and humanity in the present, comes face to face with the vengeful Scorpion of the past. The tenured and disciplined Johnny Cage we've come to know has to be face to face with his Hollywood-bred, fresh and arrogant self from his younger years, and a younger Jax has to save his own future from his jaded, older self that is given into despair. The return of Kitana and Shao Kahn gives way for one of the most interesting Outworld-centered plots that the series has ever had, where the long-dismissed agency of the Tarkatan people is finally followed up upon. And Kitana unites Outworld in a show of glory and power when she defeats her surrogate father and nemesis in combat, in a story that was insanely cathartic to watch unfold. That sounds like a lot to have going, so what went wrong? Well, let's start on a smaller scale before moving our way up, as the story for the most part is well written and directed on a micro level as MKX was, but there are certainly bits and pieces you can see cracks in, as the premise of the past characters colliding with the present sometimes does more to outline inconsistencies than it does benefit anyone. For instance, we see a Cabal of the past, unburnt and without his mask and breathing apparatus, and yet this younger Cabal is still explicitly seen using his super speed, which is a bit head-scratching considering Cabal never had super speed until he was burned and subsequently healed by Outworld magic. Johnny and Sonya also talk to one another as if they're romantically involved, despite the fact that MKX makes a fairly prominent point of the fact that their marriage had ended, with no explanation that anything had brought them back together. The younger Sonya of the past, one would think, would be a chance for Cassie to achieve catharsis over the death of her mother, but this is only kind of touched upon, and consists of Sonya being mad that Cassie let her future self die in battle, and then decides she isn't mad anymore. Meanwhile, the evil Raiden, introduced as a cliffhanger at the end of MKX, is dismissed as soon as his heroic past self enters the timeline. Gone about as soon as we know him, and meaning his plot thread that fans waited 4 years to see followed up upon went absolutely nowhere. Quite possibly the most egregious misuse of time warping, though, was its use to revive fan favorite Noob Saibot, a wraith created by the soul of the original Sub-Zero after he was slain by Scorpion. Noob meets the present Scorpion in the story as expected, But a massive missed opportunity takes elephant shape when a really strong set piece is attempted by the death of the present Scorpion in the arms of his past self, as the vindictive younger Scorpion comes face to face with the potential folly of his vengeance when his older self is killed by Devora, with whom Scorpion has barely ever interacted. All the while, Noob was adjacent, and there seemed no reason the more poetic choice of making him the killer of Scorpion wouldn't have been made. And at the risk of making a very broad statement, I can't help but feel someone truly involved with this trilogy, which thus far has played out like a series of films with very intentional continuity, would care to remember where Cabal got his super speed, that Johnny and Sonya are divorced, and that for a message about vengeance to get across, Scorpion should probably face ill-fated karma at the hands of someone he has actual history with. And my suspicions are not unfounded, as MK11's lead story writer was a shift in position from the writers of the previous games to the writer of the MKX comics, Shawn Kittelsen, who has done some phenomenal work expanding on the world of Mortal Kombat. Why this is important, we'll reproach in a moment. Let me scoot back to the story's misuse of characters, the most baffling to me of all being Liu Kang. Liu Kang was always one of Mortal Kombat's coolest figures because of how versatile he became. For the first few games in the series, he was the de facto hero figure, the safe vanilla Shaolin monk who didn't have it in him to have his own fatality until the second game. But as the spotlight shifted to the far more popular Scorpion, the makers of Mortal Kombat realized that the straightforward and milquetoast monk would only take them so far, and they got experimental with him, starting by killing him in Deadly Alliance and bringing him back as a zombie in Deception, a wandering corpse seeking a purpose where a hero once stood. The new timeline, in which Raiden, misguided by his vague visions, continually burdens the heroes, sees Liu Kang lose faith in the god he served and become arrogant in his own judgment and skill as champion of Mortal Kombat. In a sort of Harry Potter case of the Chosen One complex impacting the hero negatively, Liu Kang has a lapse of rebellion that ends in his death and transformation into a revenant, where his ego and rage create a toxic bastardization of who he once was. Mortal Kombat X's Liu Kang is interesting because it takes so many strives to highlight his flaws that were present all along, that your chosen one may be so, but he could easily belittle his friends, speak with prejudice, and turn on his master if his pedestal bloats his ego too much. MK11, however, erases all of this. The Liu Kang of the past is restored, and his flaws that made him a full-fledged character, as opposed to a generic martial artist, were scrubbed away. In fact, there are points where Kang's attitude feels almost softened in this game, as if in response to what a jerk MKX Liu Kang was. And frankly, this almost wouldn't be so bad if the writing of Mortal Kombat 11 wasn't so quick to expect us to accept Liu Kang once more as our hero, as he takes the helm of defeating Kronika at the end of the game, hijacking the new timeline story that felt to focus far more on Cassie and Raiden before this, and frankly, raising some troubling implications that a character so self-centered and even cruel in one game can be seen as redeemed with so little effort. This is where Mortal Kombat's messier timeline work begins to work against it, because what we have here isn't a Liu Kang who's learned and grown and redeemed himself, just a Liu Kang pulled from a timeline where he does turn bad and does have flaws, but gets to be the big hero before he gets a chance to indulge those, which I overall fail to see the point of. This in turn feeds into two further problems with Mortal Kombat 11's premise. The first, which can be put more briefly, is that the game feels like an excuse to wipe away the progress of characters. The contemporary Liu Kang, Scorpion, and Sonya, to name a few, have their lives and entire histories wiped away to turn back to zero and focus on their younger selves, meaning any and all development of these characters is all but moot. But more importantly is how MK11 addresses the change in Liu Kang's character, by using Kronika as a catch-all retcon. Liu Kang and Raiden in Mortal Kombat 11 find themselves on the verge of yet another conflict, and it's here that Raiden gains the convenient awareness of his memories of past timelines, all of which end with he and Liu Kang being torn apart by a sudden disagreement, and it's here we learn that this is how Kronika would cause Armageddon and reset the timeline over and over again, by forcing Earthrealm's greatest heroes against each other using her influence on time. So to hand-wave any complex characterization on part of Liu Kang or Raiden, one can no longer say for certain that Liu Kang has a weakness of entitlement, or that Raiden can have poor timing and judgment. Rather, it can all be safely explained by the fact that the big, mean Time Lady was making them fight because everyone is just a puppet on her string. And I think this was meant to elicit a sigh of relief that Raiden was never inept and Liu Kang was never mean. But would any story you enjoy really be made better by the notion that no character has free will? That all along there was a greater force irritating a character's flaws and stoking the flames of conflict? That friends turn on each other not because of natural human flaws, but because someone in charge of time in key moments robbed you of your will for her benefit. I can't conceive a universe where this is considered good writing, and it's especially insulting to fans who have been following these characters and their growth for years. This ties us back to the aforementioned head writer of Mortal Kombat 11, Shawn Kittelsen, who documents his mentality when approaching Mortal Kombat in his very telling article he wrote for Polygron, exposingly titled, "I wrote Mortal Kombat 11 and I abhor violence," which I will link in the description of this video, and it's within this article that Kittelsen describes himself as a pacifist who does not endorse graphic violence, but approached MK11 with the mentality of presenting a pill within pudding, to teach that violence isn't the answer and that heroes end conflict rather than drag it out longer. I ultimately respect Kittelsen and his sentiment. In fact, I think that the idea of pacifism implemented into Mortal Kombat caused some of the best moments of Mortal Kombat 11, namely the unity of Outworld against Shao Kahn, but caused by peace and compassion for the respective races. But I take issue with how this mentality approaches the story element of Raiden and Liu Kang's past lives and conflicts, where Shawn in the article aforementioned describes them as metaphorical characters in Kronika's fighting game, which only by breaking free of and avoiding violence can they win the day. The end goal of Mortal Kombat 11 was to end the violence of Kronika's game, and do so by writing a story which ends the Mortal Kombat universe as we know it by resetting the timeline, rendering every second of Mortal Kombat story and mythos undone and pointless. And this perfectly sums up the empty ache I felt in my gut as I watched Liu Kang defeat Kronika and become the new Lord of Time itself. Mortal Kombat isn't just a cycle of violence to me. The characters aren't just toys being bashed together, it's a story, relationships, and world. I don't see why just because it's particularly violent, it means it has to come to an abrupt end like this. There's absolutely a place for an anti-violence message, even in something with heavy violence, but there are ways to approach this that are far more thought-provoking and resonant, and don't involve retconning several dozen characters out of existence. Take the ending of Mortal Kombat 9, where the few survivors of the bloody onslaught look on and show clear remorse for the life lost in it all. They took the price of such great violence in the form of a burning city and slaughtered friends, but realize that that's why they fight for peace. There's a lot more to chew on there than just hitting the big magic reset button. And it's approaching the end of this long-winded rant that I have to ask why Mortal Kombat 11 was left in the hands of those that would undo more than 2 decades of character progression and world building. Why writers who can't seem to remember how Cabal got his super speed were allowed to decide that he and every other character should cease to be as we know them. Why a game that seemed marketed as a celebration and collision of Mortal Kombat's expansive history only seems to be ashamed of exactly that which made it so special, as it erases characters who have aged and cease to be that which they're most popular for being. Why I feel as such a longtime adorer of Mortal Kombat that I'm simply told to sit down and accept that not a single decision made by any of my favorite characters was entirely theirs, but because of some mystic time lady in the sky, and that even if those decisions mattered in the moment by some implied modicum of free will, that they've all been destroyed by a reset of time, and my favorite video game and piece of media is simply wiped away to pave the way for something new. And I always say that something new doesn't mean something old goes away, but MK11 ends on a note where, to a certain extent, something old does indeed go away. And I have to ask why I should feel anything besides antipathy towards that notion. Yet, despite how I feel about Mortal Kombat 11, my love for Mortal Kombat prior hasn't waned a bit. I wrote my previous Mortal Kombat video with every bit of love I've ever had for the series, and I wrote that a while after MK11 came out. Every nice word of that still rings true, and whenever Mortal Kombat comes back, I'll be first in line to see, because no matter how much this game made me feel vapid and kind of sad, I still love this world and these characters. I suppose it speaks to the strength of this universe that the worst thing it could do to me is cease to be, and even if I don't like the direction the story took, NRS's designers and employees deserve every accolade and bit of praise they've received for their hard work. With all this in mind, I still say, long live Mortal Kombat.